Masechet Baba Batra, Daf Kof Tet Zayin. We were talking about this case where someone has a son and a daughter, and then the son dies, but the son has a granddaughter surviving him. And after that, the father dies, and we saw that the inheritance, according to the rabbis and the Pharisees, all goes to the granddaughter, since if the son were alive, it would all go to the son. Therefore, even though the son is dead, it all goes to the inheritor of that son. So everything goes to the granddaughter, and ironically, not to the daughter. That was the position of the rabbis, even though the Sadducees said, wait, but the daughter, she is closer to the father, only one generation, there's two generations, so therefore they should split it. But one day, the rabbis were able to convince the Sadducees, and that was a happy day. They made that a Yom Tov. All right, one last follow-up to this halacha. This is talking about the story of Pilegesh Begiv'ah. Terrible story where there was a civil war in Israel of all the tribes against Binyamin. And by the end of the war, Binyamin was down to 600 men. That's it. That was the whole tribe. And this is, what are we going to do? Who are they going to marry? Because they made a vow that none of them would give any of their wives to the men of Binyamin. And so they went and they found some wives from elsewhere. And so the pasuk we're focusing on is here. They said there has to be a saving remnant for Binyamin, so the tribe will not be blotted out of Israel. In context, it's talking about finding wives for them, but this midrash is taking this pasuk by itself and saying we have to do something so that the whole tribe, the land of Binyamin, which now these 600 men, they inherited all of the land, so they each had a large portion, but we want to make sure that it remains within Binyamin for the future. Even though, okay, they won the war, but they now want Binyamin to be able to live and prosper. So what did they do to make sure that Binyamin would keep their land within the tribe? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak deber Rabbi Ameh, melamed sheitnu al shevet Binyamin shelo tirash bat haben im ha'achin. Rabbi Yitzchak of the house of Rabbi Ameh says that this pasuk teaches that they made a condition, a stipulation, special for the tribe of Binyamin, that they would not follow the normal halacha, as we said, where that a granddaughter will get the same amount as all of her uncles. In other words, if the father, let's say, had several sons, one son, two sons, three sons, and one of the sons died, then the father died, so then the sons would all inherit equally, and the granddaughter with them, right? If there was three sons and one died, the granddaughter would get a third because she gets her father's portion. So even though that's the normal halacha, nevertheless, in this case, for the tribe of Binyamin, they said, you know what, forget that halacha, we're not going to apply it to them. And in fact, if a father, let's say, has three sons and one dies, then and leaves a daughter surviving, that daughter will not get anything. Sorry, the sons will get everything. Why? Because that granddaughter, if she inherits and she goes and marries someone from a different tribe, then that section of Binyamin will go to a different tribe. And although that's okay, we can tolerate some of that happening in general, but for Binyamin specifically, where it's going to be very difficult to keep the land in the tribe, they had to make this extraordinary law just for them, that we want to keep it and give it only to the sons, and as little as possible have it go to any daughters, so that let's say there's two surviving sons, they'll each get half, and the granddaughter will get nothing. And that way, if it goes only to male sons and then grandsons, then it will stay within the tribe, whereas if it goes to daughters or granddaughters, then it will go outside the tribe. All right, now a couple of agadot on this topic of the benefits of having a son over a daughter. This is why, for a lot of history, people are much happier to have a son than a daughter, because the son is a person's retirement plan, and that means that their land and the person's name and lineage and family legacy was very much connected with their farm that would stay in a family for many, many generations. But that's only true if they have a son. So then it continues the family name. If they have a daughter, then the daughter marries someone, and then that whole land goes to the husband's family and doesn't remain within his own family. So In effect, because of the system and the way it worked, having only daughters meant that a person will have no family continuity that will be in their family farm, in their family land. So now, some agadot about that. Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai kol she'eno maniach ben leyorsho HaKadosh Baruch Hu maleh alav ebra. Rabbi Yochanan says, name of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, anyone who does not leave a son to inherit him, even if he has daughters, but he has no son, that means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is angry at him. As it says, a pasuk says, if a person has no sons, then you pass the inheritance to the daughter. And it uses the word v'habartem. But the same letters also means wrath in this pasuk in Sefanya. That day will be a day of wrath. And so this is an indication of God's anger at a person as a kind of a punishment not to give them a son to inherit them. Asher en chalifot la'amo v'lo yar'u Elohim. Rabbi Yochanan v'Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, chad amar kol she'eno maniach ben, v'chad amar kol she'eno maniach talmid. As pasuk in Tehillim, we can see the pasuk in its original context here, that Yishma'el v'ya'anem v'yosheb kedem sela asher en chalifot la'amo v'lo yar'u Elohim. So literally it can be translated as God who has reigned from the first, who will have no successor. So asher en chalifot la'amo in Peshat seems to be a description of Hashem. Hashem, who is Hashem from forever backwards, and who has no change. No one will take over and be the next king. Hashem is the king forever backwards and forever forwards. And he will give punishment and humble those who do not fear God. Okay, but the Midrash is going to take this en chalifot lamo not as a description of Hashem, but rather as a description of the person who Hashem is angry at and who will humble. So what does that mean? Shed en chalifot lamo, someone who doesn't have a replacement and is not fearful of God, or that's a sign that they're not fearful of God. And that's why they do not have a replacement. What does that refer to? Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi have an argument about this. We're not sure which rabbi says which opinion. One of them says this is someone who does not have a son to inherit him. And the other rabbi said this is someone who does not have a student to leave behind. A student is very important for any teacher to have. Many students is even greater, but at least one student who will carry on the teachings of that rabbi, of that sage. Without a student, that means all the things that rabbi taught will be lost because he doesn't have a student that will remember it and propagate it and teach it to further students in the future. So having a son is a biological legacy and an intellectual legacy for a sage. Here are compared to each other. Now we want to know which rabbi said which opinion. Tistayem Rabbi Yochanan damar tamid. Damar Rabbi Yochanan den garmeh de asira abir. Tistayem de Rabbi Yochanan damar talmid. It must be Rabbi Yochanan is the one that said the opinion that this pasuk, that Hashem is going to humble, he has anger against those who do not have a replacement. Rabbi Yochanan is the one that said is talking about having a replacement within a student, and not a son, because Rabbi Yochanan himself lost 10 sons. In fact, we have a story back in Berachot that he would he would carry around with him the bone of his 10th son, maybe a tooth of his 10th son or bone, and he would take it to houses of mourning, so that, let's say someone, Bar Minan, they lost a child, Rabbi Yochanan would come and visit them and said, you lost a child, that's terrible. I lost 10 children, look, here is the bone of my 10th child. And that would cheer them up, well, a little bit. Misery loves company. And it says, as bad as you think it is, I'm even worse. And then the mourner would say, wow, you really are even worse. At least my sorrow is not as bad as yours. And that may cheer up the person, or at least be able to share and empathize with that person. So Rabbi Yochanan is going going around in a way kind of boasting about this fact that he lost all these kids. Now, if this was a punishment, he didn't have any other sons. And so if this was a punishment showing God's anger, then Rabbi Yochanan would not be going around kind of showing this off, because this would be a sign of a curse. So therefore, it must be that Rabbi Yochanan is of the opinion that it's the problem is not having a student. Rabbi Yochanan had many students, and so he had no problem there. And so Rabbi Yochanan must be the one that says God is angry with one who does not leave over a student. So since Rabbi Yochanan, the one that says it's a student, it must be that the other says Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi is the one that says that God is angry at someone who does not leave over a son to inherit him. But is that true? Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi la azil lebet tamiyah ela lebeman deshchi bela bane dichtiv bechu bacho laholech ve'amar Rav Yehuda amar Rav laholech belo ben zachar ela Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi hu de'amar tamid. So Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, we have a story that he would not go to houses of mourning all the time. He would only go to a most severe case of someone who dies without a son. If someone dies without any sons, then that's especially sad. Look, it's one thing. Okay, everybody dies, but if you leave over a son to inherit, to keep your land, to continue your legacy, at least that person has continuity. Someone who has no sons, so that Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi would go out of his way, take time from his Torah, and go and visit them. As the pasuk Yirmiyah says, but weep sore for him that goes away. What do you mean that him that goes away? Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav says that he goes away without a male child. That means he goes away, and that's it. He leaves nothing behind. Now, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi goes out of his way to go to those houses of mourning, because they have no legacy. So obviously he's very sad for them. If he thought that this was a curse, a sign of God's anger, then he wouldn't especially only go to these people that deserve such punishment. He would not go to those houses of mourning. So that shows that Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, he must be the one that says that Hashem is angry at those who don't leave a student behind. But though someone who doesn't leave a son behind, what could you do? It's an unfortunate thing. It's not their fault. It doesn't show that God is angry at them. It shows that the person is not lucky that he was not able to have such a thing. Okay, so now we have a problem, because now both of the sages have to be that they both say it's a student. So Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Huda amar tamid, Rabbi Yochanan amar ben. Now that you prove that Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, he's the one that said that God is angry at those who don't have a student, so it must be Rabbi Yochanan is the other opinion that says it's someone who doesn't have a son is who Hashem is angry at. So we have a problem. Kashiyat Rabbi Yochanan. This seems a contradiction, because from the story of Rabbi Yochanan, who brought around the bone of his 10th son, that sounds like he's the one that said student. But from the fact that Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says student, must be Rabbi Yochanan is the one that said son. So which is it? La kashya hadideh. There's no problem. Rabbi Yochanan, when he said above that Hashem is angry at someone who doesn't have a son, that he was relaying what his own teacher said. But that was not his own opinion. His own personal opinion was Hashem is angry at someone who doesn't have a student. And so that's why he himself thought that the student thing is a problem. He had students, that's okay. And he would go around and console people with the bone, because he didn't think Hashem is angry at someone who doesn't have a son. When he said that, he was quoting his teacher, which is interesting because his teacher who said that does have a student in Rabbi Yochanan who repeated those words. So he's a faithful student in that he repeats his teacher's words, although he himself actually disagreed. And that explains how we have both of those opinions above. All right, so now we have a few statements from Rabbi Pinchas ben Chama on this subject. Darash Rabbi Pinchas ben Chama. Ma'dichti v'hadad shama b'misram ki shachav David im avotav v'chi met Yoav sar hasava. Mipnei ma beDavid nemra bo shechiva uByoav nemra bo mita. Rabbi Pinchas ben Chama taught. What is this pasuk that says that Yehadad, he from Egypt, heard that David slept with his fathers, meaning died, and he also heard that Yoav, the commander of David, also that he died. And then he decided to go and act based on that. So how come he uses different language? How come regarding David it says that he lay down, shachav David, a euphemism for death, but Yoav it just says that he died, kimet. Why use different verbs? And the answer is, David sheniach ben nemra bo shecheba, Yoav shelo niach ben nemra bo mita. Since King David left a son after him, so says he rested. He rested with his fathers, a nicer way, because yes, although he died, but because he had a son after him, so he could say it in a euphemism in a nice way. He rested, but now his son will take over for him. Whereas Yoav, who did not leave a son behind, that's it. That's a final death, because there's nobody to continue his legacy. So another proof of the message that we saw above. Ve'Yoav lo hiniach ben v'haketib mebenei Yoav Obadiah ben Yechiel. Wait a second. Why are you saying that Yoav didn't leave a son? The pasuk says the children of Yoav, one of the children of Yoav was Obadiah ben Yechiel. So you see that Yoav had a son. La David sheniach ben kemoto nemra bo shechiba. Yoav shelo hiniach ben kemoto nemra bo mita. Rather, they both had sons, but the difference is in the quality. David, who had a son that was like him, King Shlomo, he became the king himself, was successful, and so it says regarding him, Shechiba, that he rested. Whereas Yoav, although he had a son, but the son was not as great as Yoav himself, that's why it says Mita. So it's not just about having a son, but also having a worthy son. Darash Rabbi Pinchas ben Chama, Kasha aniyut betoch beto shel adam yoter me-50 makot. Now, on a slightly different subject, Rabbi Pinchas ben Chama also said that poverty in one's home is worse than having 50 plagues. Shene'emar, Hanuni, Hanuni, atem re'ai, ki yad Eloah nag'a bi, v'kamri le chabre, hishamer al tefen el aven, ki al ze bacharta me'oni. So how do we know it's worse than 50 plagues? So if we learn it from Iyov, what Iyov said and what his friends responded to him. Iyov himself said, have pity upon me, my friends, because the hand of God has been against me. Naga bi, has given plagues to me. So we're comparing this to Mitzrayim. In Mitzrayim it says, Etzba Elohim, and so the finger of God, that was 10 plagues in Egypt. So if the finger is 10 plagues, then a whole hand that it says here, Yad, is 5 times. So therefore, Iyov got 50 different punishments. 50 plagues, and the friends tell Iyov, be careful, regard not iniquity, for this you have chosen rather than poverty. His friends consult him to say, well, it's true you got these 50 plagues, but at least you're not poor. Being poor is worse. So from here we learn that poverty, and we're talking about poverty, you don't know how you're going to eat the next meal, that is worse than even having 50 plagues. Darash Rabbi Pinchas bar Chama, כל שיש לו חולה בתוך ביתו, ילך אצל חכם ויבקש עליו רחמים. שנאמר, חמת מלך מלאכי מוות, ואיש חכם יכפר עינה. And a last derasha from the same sage, Rabbi Pinchas bar Chama. If anyone has a sick person in their home, they should go to a chacham and ask for mercy, that the chacham should pray on behalf of that sick person. As the pasuk says in Mishleh, the wrath of a king is as a messenger of death. When Hashem is angry at someone, then they will send a sickness. But a wise man will pacify it. Ish Chacham is talking about not just a good doctor, but also a great sage who can pacify and pray on behalf of that person. We next analyze the end of the Mishnah that says, Zeh hakelal kol hakodem benachala yose'e yerecho kodmin, ve'ha'av kodem lecho yose'e yerecho. The basic principle is that anyone who proceeds regarding inheritance, if that person is dead, then that person's descendants will precede anyone else who is next on the list. So, for example, if someone dies and their father is an easier example, someone dies and they have a son and a grandson, but the son dies first. So now that person dies and there's no son, but that son has a son, therefore it will go to the deceased's grandson before it will go to anybody else, like like a father or brother or uncle or anybody else. So that's the first principle. Second principle is that a father comes first before any of his descendants. That a father will come first, even though the father has a son who would be the brother of the deceased, the father gets it before any of the father's descendants. Okay, now these two principles are don't necessarily come to the same conclusion as we're about to see. Rami bar Chama, Abi ha'av v'achi ha'av, kegon Abraham v'Ishmael b'nichsei Esav, eze mehen kodem. Rami bar Chama, who is known to ask very incisive questions about very technical details, but that sometimes will really test the principles of the system, he asked, what if you have a father's father of the deceased and the father's brothers? For example, who would inherit, Abraham or Yishmael, in the property of Esav? Here's a little fancy chart. You have Abraham, who has two kids, Ishmael and Yitzhak. And Yitzhak has two kids, Yaakov and Esav. Forget Yaakov for now, make believe he's not here. And Yitzhak dies first, and then Esav dies. Who will inherit? Will it be the father's father? You can say that because one of the principles we saw is that a father inherits before his descendants. And so, well, it goes to the father, but Yitzhak is not around. So, but if he was around, who would it go to? It would go to his father. So should it go to Avraham up there? Or maybe you'll say it should go up only one generation. And, well, you'd go to Yitzhak, but Yitzhak's not around. Maybe you should go to his brother rather than to his father. So what's the answer? And the answer is, actually, this is quite an easy question. This was not hard to figure out. The Mishnah says explicitly that a father comes first before any of his descendants, and therefore clearly it will go to Avraham because Ishmael is only a descendant of Avraham. So Esav, assuming he has no other children, and so it would go to Yitzhak. Yitzhak is dead. So who was alive? Avraham. Fine. So it goes to, if Avraham is alive, then it goes to Avraham before any of his descendants, meaning Ishmael, who's his descendant. So obviously it goes to Avraham. So now we ask, Rami bar Chama agab churfe la'ayin be. Why did Rami bar Chama ask this question if it's an explicit Mishnah? And the answer is because of his sharp mind, he didn't look at the Mishnah carefully. Sometimes when someone is looking at something so carefully with a microscope, they might not see even the big picture, even basic things. And so, because he was looking into something so deeply, he asked a basic question. Actually, what we're about to see is that this was a setup question. Rambam Chama actually wanted us to focus on the next question. So the first was just a setup to say, okay, this is an easy one, right? Okay, you got this principle. Now I'm really going to test it. Ba'i Rami bar Chama, Abi ha'av v'achiv, kegon Abraham v'Yaakov b'nichsei Esav, eze mehen kodem. What if you have someone that dies? Who comes first? Assuming they have no children, and the father died, is it the father's father or the brothers of the deceased? For example, who would inherit, Avraham or Yaakov, in the inheritance of Esav? So here you have, once again, Esav dies, and this time we'll include Yaakov in the mix, and Yitzhak dies first, and then Esav dies. Who will inherit? Will it be his own brother? And that makes sense because, if Yitzhak was alive, then Yitzhak would inherit Esav. Again, Esav has no children, so Yitzhak would get it. Now that Yitzhak is dead, remember one of the principles was that it goes to the descendants. Whoever takes precedence, it goes to the descendants of that person before it moves on to the next person on the list. And so since it would go to the father Yitzhak, but he's not around, we should look at his descendants first. It should go to Yaakov. That's one principle. But there's another principle that says that you always go to the father before any of his descendants. And here, since it would go to Yitzhak, but he's not around, so it should go to the father, Avraham, before any of Avraham's descendants. And Yaakov is also one of Avraham's descendants, and so is Yitzhak. So maybe it should go all the way back to Avraham, and he should take precedence. So what are we going to do? Rava says, I have an answer. We'll follow the principle that a father comes first before any of his descendants. So you go to the father first. That means it would go all the way back to Avraham. So isn't that an explicit Mishnah? What were you thinking when you were asking? And Bar Chama, actually, I think differently. It's because the Mishnah also says, Yoseh Yerecho Shelo velo Yoseh Yerecho Shel Beno. It says that you go in order, and then you go to the descendants of that person, and not the descendants of his son. Which means, when would you go all the way up to the father's father? Only after you exhausted the descendants of the father, right before you get to the grandfather, because it says that the father comes before his descendants, but not the descendants of his children. In other words, yes, you do have a principle that it goes to a father before any of that person's descendants. So it would go to Abraham before Ishmael. Yes, that's true. But it doesn't go to Abraham before the descendants of his son, Yitzchak. Abraham was not going to precede Yaakov. So therefore, the principle should be that if it goes from Esav to Yitzchak, Yitzchak is dead, first check Yitzchak's descendants. Goes to Yaakov. That's what you do first. Only then you say, well, he has no descendants. Well, then it goes to the father. Because the father precedes any of his immediate descendants, right? And but does not precede the descendants of his son. Abraham does not come before Yaakov, and so therefore, Rami Bar Chama says, see, I reconcile these two principles in a different way than Rava did. So that's why you see his question was actually quite a good question and required clarification. And now we not only hear him, but we support Rami Bar Chama. Hachinami mistabera dekatane zekelal kol hakodem benachala yosei yerecho kodmin vilu ite liYitzchak Yitzchak kodem hashtaname delete Yitzchak Yaakov kodem shema mina. It makes sense with the language of the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says this is the principle that anyone who proceeds in the order of inheritance, that person's descendants also proceed before you go to the next person on the list of inheritance. Now, if Yitzchak were alive, Yitzchak would get it. Now that Yitzchak is not alive, it has to go first to the descendants of Yitzchak. Who is that? That is Yaakov. So in fact, we give it to Yaakov in that case, and only if there were no descendants of Yitzchak, only then would it go back up a generation. And from there, if that grandfather were not alive, then it would go to the descendants of that grandfather. And so now we understand how all of the clauses of the Mishnah fit together nicely. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.